Considering Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is slowly coming to a halt. At least kinda. They decided to call 1D&D 5e in the end after all, whatever. Considering this chapter of the game will come to an end in 2024, I've got to make a tier list about the currently available adventure modules for 5th edition. And considering this is a world building channel, the story and impact on the world, the interesting bits about most of these modules will have the greater impact on my rating. If gameplay would make a larger impact, many would be D tier, which I renamed into the don't run this tier. I'd always recommend running your own homebrew game instead of a module, but for many that's not really feasible, which is completely fair. But even then, there are many homebrew alternatives on pages like the DM's Guild that do better jobs than many of the original modules. But there is a small handful of good ones that redeem the concept of official 5e adventure modules. Oh, and I won't rate the Wildemount, Spelljammer or Dragonlance modules, since either I haven't read them, or they killed me in a physical and metaphysical sense. You can pick which did which. So let's get into it and start with the Tales of the Yawning Portal. Yawn. This is one of the many anthology books, and probably one of the worst to talk about story-wise, since it's mostly a collection of nostalgia dungeons. You jump into the many portals within the famous adventurer tavern of the Yawning Portal in Waterdeep, and get into many classic old-school dungeon adventures, and it famously includes the nerfed version of the Tomb of Horrors, probably the most infamous dungeon in the history of the entire game, and a total death trap. I really don't recommend running this, except for the novelty as a one-shot perhaps, since there is no cohesive story and just dungeons, which are just funhouse dungeons and one death trap. I'll put this into D tier. Out of the Abyss is the only adventurer book I haven't fully read or played yet, but I am currently experiencing it as a player, and we are pretty far in, and I can put down at least some judgment for now. The story hook and the entire plot of Out of the Abyss is probably one of the more interesting out there. You start out as a prisoner, or rather a slave in Welkenwelf, a mining settlement belonging to the most infamous of the Underdark's inhabitants, the Drow. Of course, it's your duty as an RPG character to free yourself, but what follows isn't that much better. You're still trapped inside the Underdark, a horrendous maze in the earthen depths of the continent of Faerun. You're chased by your captors, and even worse, the demons of the Abyss, including their lords, all flock into the Underdark to wage a war of supremacy, including the Demogorgon who's on the cover art of the book. It's a harrowing journey for players and the DM, and a hard module to run for both players and DMs. If you want a bit of positivity in your story, just a little bit, just a little bit, stay away from it. If you like a grind on your character's soul and sanity, I'll recommend it. B tier. Storm King's Thunder. This is Attack on Titan if you wouldn't be stuck within the walls of one settlement but have the entire sword course at your feet to explore instead. I wish. The whole premise of this adventure module sounds cool and epic at first, but I seriously don't recommend playing it. The story doesn't have any tension besides the initial attack of the giants. It sounds cool to go to the many places the story sends you to, until your GM realizes that they didn't even bother to include any information of these cities, like Waterdeep, or any other settlement you go to for that matter. And then there's a boring MacGuffin hunt, and the cool bits I won't spoil have nothing to do with giants actually. Well, except the end fight maybe. Spoiler! The ending lets you fight against the blue dragon as a giant, because the chromatic dragons are behind everything all along. I wish 5e had the balls for more gimmicks like these, but they don't, which is sad, except in one other module. Anyways, Storm King's Thunder is a C tier. It's better if you put a lot of work into it, but if you have to put a lot of work into a module to be playable, just run your own campaign. Waterdeep Dragonheist is a relatively short module, and the only one that's actually quite replayable. There is a lot of stuff I like about it. but I will start with the story. You are in the great city of Waterdeep, which is really well fleshed out and detailed in this book, a plus point. Because of some shenanigans, you get your hands onto a tavern you have to run. Those shenanigans deepen further as you find yourself woven into one of 4 possible plots, which all revolve around a treasure, which is somewhere within the city. Where the treasure is exactly depends on the plot. And of course, the villain depends on the plot as well. And any of those villains can easily hold a candle to the community's favorite villain, Strahd von Zarovich. Some of those villains in Waterdeep Dragonheist are actually better in my opinion. The twist is that those villains would stomp you into the ground in actual combat, which is why roleplay is your most powerful weapon in this adventure. The plot is mostly about sneakily and slyly getting to the goal first, while dancing on the villain's nose, which is a very good twist for a D&D module. By the way, the adventure is only level 1 to 5, so there's really a huge difference between you and the villains. Waterdeep Dragonheist is an S-tier adventure, and probably my favorite 5e adventure overall. I recommend it to everyone who likes roleplay. The only downside I can see is the fact that low-level play in D&D isn't fun, but luckily you don't have to play much of D&D in this module. You just have to roleplay. Curse of Strahd fans are probably fuming that I already declared the Dragonheist as my favorite module, but fret not, this is my second favorite. Oh wonder, Curse of Strahd is actually good, yes. Like the Dragonheist, most of the module revolves around the greatness of the villain. During the adventure, you somehow get stuck in the realm of Barovia, ruled by the evil vampire Strahd. Your obvious goal is to defeat the vampire and flee Barovia, but along the lines you have to weaken him, while he is constantly on your toes, taunting or threatening your lives. The world building of an entire barony haunted by an evil vampire really hits the spot in this module. The atmosphere is just perfect on its own, and probably one of the best overall experiences you can run on any table. The only real downsides of this module are on the gameplay side of things. The introductory death house is near unplayable, and Strahd's castle is a labyrinth and has truly one of the traps of all time. S tier. Baldur's Gate Descent into the Avernus has next to nothing to do with Baldur's Gate. The entire Baldur's Gate bit could be cut out and nothing of value was lost. The book does deliver a pretty detailed description of the city, even better detailed than most of the Avernus, where most of the game is set in. Your characters are tasked with the nigh impossible task to save the city of Elturel that was thrown into hell. First of all, wizards, if you ever remake this adventure, please have the balls to throw Baldur's Gate into the hell if you write it on the book's title. Second of all, the adventure sounds and feels cooler than it is. The way the book is structured, which is barely at all by the way. The DM really has to put some work into bringing the players into the right direction, since it's either railroading or basically no story thread at all. But well, at least you can write on Mad Mage like Hellcars that are powered by literal souls of the wicked. That alone hooked me, but it's still just a B tier. Please cut out the entire bit before Candlekeep or even Elturel. Just don't run it. Start at level 3. Go to Elturel, please. Ghosts of Saltmarsh is another book I have only read, but the actually interesting part about the book isn't the actual adventure, at least in my eyes. Ghosts of Saltmarsh is set in the titular Saltmarsh in Greyhawk, which makes the module the only official 5e content within the setting, I think. As adventurers, you fight off different threats the town has to face, including lizards and aboleths. It never really hooked or interested me on its own, especially since the cool bit about the book isn't featured in any of the adventure. It has ship combat rules, which actually work and are interesting to play with. I used them, they are really good, unlike the ones in these Spelljammer books, which are bad. Don't use those. Use the ones in this book. C tier. Mostly because the interesting bit isn't the actual adventure. Hoard of the Dragon Queen. This is unarguably the worst bit of TTRPG content the world has ever seen. Even Fatal, please don't look this game up, has more value than Hoard of the Dragon Queen. The entire adventure from start to finish makes no sense. The characters featured in it are horseshit, and the encounter designs are unarguably bad and unbalanced and not thought of properly. Even worse than in other modules. And no, being the first adventure isn't an excuse if there's better stuff. You have to know, during the adventure you are threatened by the Cult of the Dragons, whose goal is to summon the avatar of Tiamat into the world, so the world can be ruled by dragons again. Why normal people would be interested in it is never explained. While the villains are added, well, the Forgotten Realms classic comical evil wizards, the Red Wizards of Tai, are added for shits and giggles. There's a racist elf, some woman who is just horny for dragons, and then there are some dragonborn and half-dragon that are racist too, but at least they are dragon-related. The giant at the end takes the crown of stupid writing. The worst of all, most you do is incredibly boring, with the worst offender being this goddamn caravan. Oh, and by the way, barely anything you do during the adventure really matters in the grand scheme of things. You can run the follow-up adventure Rise of Tiamat, even without playing this, and it doesn't really matter. Hoard of the Dragon Queen is the worst. Literally, don't run this module ever. D tier. The Mines of Phendelver almost became a classic at this point. Maybe it's my bubble, but the goblin encounter that is famous for slaughtering parties that play the game for the first time is just legendary. Anyways, it's a starter adventure with a mediocre story that shows you everything classic D&D has on offer. Dungeons, combat, goblins, mysteries, your death. There are better experiences overall, B tier. Only play this with newbies. Princes of the Apocalypse was the first module I played online in Roll20, which is a few years ago by now, and also just for a small handful of sessions. But I've read the book by now, and what I've read is okay. The story brings you into the Desarine Valley that is threatened by the titular Princes of the Apocalypse and their elemental cults. While the cults themselves aren't any more interesting than the Cult of the Dragon, the villains that hate each other but still have to work together have a bit more oomph to them, which is good. Especially since the players decide which of the four villains become their nemesis at the end. The issue is that to get to the cool bit, you have to get through an unstructured sandbox, which doesn't sound really fun, but at least there are interesting tidbits around. B tier. The Rise of Tiamat is the follow-up adventure to Hoard of the Dragon Queen, and thus doesn't start at level 1 for a change. And you really don't need to play Hoard of the Dragon Queen to play this. Rise suffers from many of the same problems as Hoard of the Dragon Queen, including uninteresting villains first and foremost. But it does offer some variety by simply sending you through a theme park, showing you different bits and pieces of the Sword Coast, from the icy coast of the Icewind Dale to the forgotten tombs of the Yuan Ti. There's a council you have to attend as players decide the outcome of the war against the cult, and the major factions of the Sword Coast take a part, and what you achieve in Hoard just gives you some plus points in the overall rating during the council, as council members can jump off and leave if you decide wrongly on certain matters, which makes the fight harder. This council mechanic is a cool mechanic in my opinion, which redeems the whole idea of the adventure a bit, and it's also one of the few times people in power do at least something of note in 5e modules, which is why I only put it into C tier and not D tier. I still wouldn't recommend running it, but you can take the council mechanic for your homebrew adventures, for example. Tomb of Annihilation. This is the first 5e module I've ever run, but I haven't run all of it. Mostly since we quickly jumped over to my own setting once I pitched the idea of Greeks, but industrialized, to a bunch of history and archaeology students. But I've read it all, so I can say that the module is really good, but it's grindy. For whatever reasons, you land in Port Nyanzaru on the peninsula of Chult, which just happens to be cursed by the Lich Assessorek, who's harvesting everyone's soul for his evil schemes. The entire adventure has a sense of urgency, since there are mechanics on the whole soul harvesting thing. The sandbox you're offered within the island of Chult is probably the most detailed after Barovia. And the thing I like the most about it is the setting itself. It's not the Sword Coast and offers an interesting view into different people of Chult, which are inspired after both Mayan and African cultures. And it's not the Sword Coast, by the way. The downside is a really long dungeon, since the dungeon keeps many of the old school design philosophies of AD&D, which just aren't really fun. It's still an A-tier adventure, however. The dungeon of the Mad Mage has basically no story and is a grindfest for the hack and slayest of them all, but it does that really well. However, there are some bits and pieces that are actually interesting, like entire settlements just left within the dungeon under Waterdeep, but so much are just endless halls of nothing. It theoretically is the sequel adventure to Dragonheist, but they couldn't be more different to one another, as one is next to total roleplay and the other is next to total combat. If you want to run a dungeon grind, I'd recommend the Abomination Vaults, which have a 5e conversion, or just play the dungeon of the Mad Mage. If you want to do something more, stay away from it, C tier. Icewind Dale. Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden, is another survive this inhospitable region you can't get out of for a while adventure, but I like it. The famous Icewind Dale, which is already cold on a good day, is completely frozen because of the whims of the evil goddess Auril. What sets the adventure apart is the really good world building between the many towns of the Icewind Dale that have to suffer through the cold and cope on different ways, including the many threats they have to face besides the goddess and her anger. My favorite part of the adventure is that it's actually very dynamic and your decisions have impact, as you won't be able to save everyone while looking for a way to end the frozen curse of the valley. The downside is the weird structure the adventure has, but the adventure's ending is probably both the coolest and the most interesting of any official 5e adventure. You delve into some ancient lore, while there are some terrible decisions the players have to make. A tier. The structure and the lack of a villain like the 4 in Waterdeep or Strahd brings it down to A tier, otherwise it would have been S tier. It's still very highly recommended. Candlekeep Mysteries. Candlekeep Mysteries is another anthology I've only read. Unlike the other anthology books, this isn't nostalgia bait, but I don't really like the way the players are introduced to the different adventures. You look for answers in the library of Candlekeep. Answers to what question? You have a book that opens a portal and you enter the book and portal. Oh, do we now? Interesting. There's no real player agency to the whole premise. I'd recommend playing them as one-shots or just a way to fill larger adventures you're playing. The dungeons themselves are fine, C tier. The Wild Beyond the Witchlight is another role-playing focused adventure that doesn't hit as much as Waterdeep in my opinion, but it's still quite good. The Feywild is very reminiscent of Alice in Wonderland's story in the Wonderland and has many interesting nooks and crannies to explore during your adventure. It's probably the most eccentric of the modules settings by a long shot. It's twisted and malformed by the 3 villains of the story, however. A coven of hags that plan to run the whole place. Of course, it's your job to free the whole place, and the book claims it's achievable solely by role-playing, but I doubt it. As in many cases, it's just not realistic. A tier. Journeys through the Radiant Citadel and Keys from the Golden Vault. The 2 newest adventures that don't fall into the criteria I mentioned earlier. I have run neither and only skimmed either, so I can't really rate them. But they are anthologies with several adventures. The Radiant Citadel doesn't have one big theme for their adventures, besides being somewhat connected through the ethereal playing. And the Keys from the Golden Vault are all about heists and heist adventures. In both cases I just recommend picking single adventures out for either one-shot plots or a short campaign or something intermediate or maybe even inspiration for something original. No rank. And lastly, your homebrew adventure. Homebrew adventures are rules as written. Almost all adventures in D&D need so much prep work for you as a dungeon master that I don't see a reason as a GM not to make your own adventures. You can steal as much as you like, nobody cares as long as everyone has fun. But pre-written adventures truly don't need more or less work than any other campaign. So do it, please. I beg you, make your own homebrew adventures. So that's it for today's video, world builders. I hope you liked it. If you disagree with my takes, let me know in the comments. And by the way, run your homebrew adventure.